Place where there was no language, where there was no possibility of acquiring language. And I'm a writer, and a writer without language in a world where there was no language made it very, very bitter for me. There were no newsstands, there were no libraries, there was no culture, there was no possibility of learning anything. And for me, the real poverty is the poverty of language. It was a place of great sadness. It was a place where, you really couldn't thrive, couldn't survive. And then when I was about 50 years old, while the Bronx, was, in a horrific shape, a BBC crew decided to visit the Bronx thinking it was like East Berlin, So when I went there, I discovered, when I looked at the streets, that, in the empty spaces of my life, there was a kind of imagination, and I grew out of that imagination, so that not only was it a place where I wanted to go, it was like a fix, it was like a shot. I needed to go back there. I needed to feel the roots, where I grew up. Robert Moses, the master builder of New York City, and what Moses did is that he decided he was going to divide the Bronx, build a highway right through its spine so that it would be divided by north and south. Okay. Everything north of the highway retained its identity. It was middle class. It may have been ghettoized in terms of Italians, Jews, Latinos, but it retained its identity. Everything south of the highway lost its identity. It lost its power, it lost its grace. But more important than that, he had the right of eminent domain. So if your neighborhood happened to cross the area of the highway he wanted to build, he went to the governor and said, okay, we tear down this neighborhood. Now, these were lower middle class neighborhoods, people who didn't have money to hire lawyers, to contest him, to fight him, to argue, to stall, because you could stall him forever. So he just tore down very, very fragile, lower middle class neighborhoods in Italian, Jewish, black areas in the Bronx, and they never recovered, completely destroyed. The only reason that the South Bronx still exists is that we have Yankee Stadium. And Yankee Stadium is a kind of stronghold, and we have a few courthouses in that area. Without Yankee Stadium, everything in the South Bronx would have deteriorated. The BBC was doing a documentary on the Bronx. It must have seemed like an exotic place to the British, with mile upon mile of rubble that reminded them of the London Blitz, because this is the way London was during the war. We roamed the Badlands in a big van, and I left, and I felt a kind of exhilaration. And this was very surprising, because I thought I would be so depressed. I would be walking with my nose near the ground. I wouldn't be even able to stand up, As if I inhabited all the empty, spaces. And I realized that I'd been shaped as a writer, not with words I didn't have, because I didn't have them. Not with lavish pencil cases, not with library books I had never borrowed, but with some ghost's vocabulary. I filled that amorphous void of the South Bronx with my own imagination. And as I stood on a hill near the Grand Concourse with the BBC and its camera crew, peering at the carcasses of burnt apartment houses below, I sensed a willful design in all that ruin. Could almost hear a chant, a war cry, or perhaps it was a ringing in my ears. Whatever music I had risen from that bedlam of the Bronx. All the staccato sounds, the syncopation of sadness and loss, I'd been like an amnesiac during my self-banishment from the Bronx, never realizing that each sentence I wrote had come from these lower depths. Now that's very important, is that I couldn't have flourished or continued to write without this imagination that I'd gathered from the void. And it's Emily Dickinson who said about language that it had to be zero at the bone. And this is the way I was.